The instructor tried to drag the human girl. She ended the lesson instead. His hand closed around my wrist before I even heard him move, and the whole training bay went silent around us. I did not flinch. That surprised him more than anything else that happened afterward. My name is Mira Voss, and at that exact moment, 60 other cadets were watching a 9-foot-tall Voss instructor try to pull me out of a live coordination drill in front of the entire cohort. His grip was iron. His voice was already rising, already reaching for the observation gallery where the senior officers sat behind reinforced glass, already shaping the sentence he wanted them to remember. Weakest link. Watch what happens when the human is removed from the exercise. He never got to finish that sentence, and I am going to tell you exactly why, but first you need to understand how we got to that moment, because none of it happened by accident. Not his grip, not my calm, not the 6 weeks that came before it. I joined Cohort 9 as the only human among 61 cadets pulled from 11 different worlds across conquered space. There were Vosk with their layered arms and quiet contempt for anything that bled easily. There were Alira with their soft telepathic hum that let them read a room the way I read a printed page. There were Karn twins who communicated through vibration and barely spoke aloud at all. And there was me, standing at the back of the formation on the first day, feeling every single stare land on me like a verdict already written. Instructor Threll delivered that verdict out loud, on the very first morning, without even bothering to look at my file first. He said humans were an interesting addition to the program. He said it the way someone describes a stray animal that wandered into a formal dinner. He said our species had only been part of the Concord for 11 standard years, and in that time we had produced exactly nothing that suggested we belonged in a coordination wing built for combat readiness. He said we were, in his words, built for typing messages and making friends, not for anything that involved actual pressure. Nobody laughed, because laughing at that stage of training gets you extra drills, but I saw a few of the Alira cadets glance my way with something that might have been pity. I did not need pity. I needed 6 weeks to prove him wrong, and 6 weeks is exactly what he gave me, whether he meant to or not. The seating chart on day 1 put me at the very back of the room, behind cadets half my height, where I could not see the tactical displays clearly. I said nothing and adjusted my angle. On day 4, during a systems briefing, Threll explained a complex targeting protocol to the entire room in one pass, then turned to me specifically and repeated it slower, word by word, as though I needed the extra repetition that nobody else required. I said nothing and took better notes than anyone else in the room, because embarrassment is just another kind of fuel if you decide to use it that way. By the second week, the pattern was obvious to everyone, except the instructors reviewing our files from a distance. My scores were solid. My simulation runs were clean. My teamwork ratings, gathered anonymously from the other cadets I worked with, were actually higher than average, because it turns out that when you grow up on a planet where nobody can read your mind and nobody can feel your intentions before you speak them, you learn to communicate very clearly with your actual words. That skill translates well into a fire team. Grace Bennett, my closest friend in the cohort and a quiet, sharp-minded cadet from a farming world 3 systems from Earth, told me once that I was the only human she had ever met, and that she expected me to be louder. I told her most people expect that. She laughed and said I was the calmest person in our entire fire team, and coming from someone who could sense stress radiating off other cadets like heat off a hull, that meant something. Owen Whitfield, another human in the wider training program though not in our specific cohort, warned me early on that Threll had a history. 2 previous human cadets had transferred out of his sections in the last 3 years, both citing reasons that never quite made it into the official record. Owen told me this in the mess hall, quietly, like he was handing me a piece of equipment I would need later, and did not know it yet. I thanked him and kept training. By the 5th week, Threll had stopped pretending his behavior was about training standards. During a close-quarters coordination exercise, he paired me with a cadet nearly twice my mass, and told the room, in that same flat instructional tone, that this would demonstrate how a fire team compensates for a fragile member. I did not correct him in front of everyone. I simply ran the exercise, used footwork instead of force, redirected momentum instead of matching it, and finished the drill with a clean completion time that beat 3 other pairs in the room. Threll marked it down as luck. He wrote luck in an official evaluation log, which is the kind of thing that looks very bad later when someone else reads it. I want to be clear that I never reported him during those 5 weeks. I know now that I probably should have. But early in a training program, when you are the only one of your kind in the entire wing, reporting an instructor feels like confirming every assumption he has already made about you. So I did what my grandmother did back on Earth when she trained new pilots decades ago in a much older kind of program. I kept my head level, I kept my results clean, and I let the numbers build a case that words alone never could. The live fire coordination drill in Base 7 was supposed to be the final major exercise before evaluation week. 6 cadet fire teams, full haptic feedback pods, a simulated hostile boarding scenario that tested communication, positioning, and split-second decision-making under pressure that felt completely real, even though nothing in the room could actually cause harm. I was assigned to rear coverage and communications relay for my fire team, working alongside Grace, Owen, and 3 Karn cadets whose names translated roughly into tones I had learned to recognize over 5 weeks of training together. The drill began exactly on schedule. Our fire team moved through the first simulated corridor with the kind of coordination that only comes from weeks of repetition. Grace called positioning. I relayed status updates to the central console and flagged a simulated hostile presence 2 segments ahead, before our forward scanners even registered it, because I had learned to read the tension in Grace's voice half a second before her instruments confirmed what she felt. We cleared the first objective with a completion time that put us at the top of the leaderboard for that block. We were 60 seconds into the second objective when everything stopped. Instructor Threll froze the simulation from the control deck, which was already unusual, because live drills are supposed to run to completion unless there is an actual safety concern. He walked down from the observation platform, crossed the floor of Base 7 in long, deliberate strides, and stepped directly into the physical space of my simulation pod while the haptic feedback systems were still active around me. That is the moment where I told you this story began. His hand closing around my wrist, the whole bay going quiet, his voice rising toward the observation gallery, already reaching for an audience. He pulled, not gently. He wanted me stumbling, wanted my footing broken in front of 60 other cadets and however many senior officers were watching from behind that reinforced glass, wanted a visual that matched the sentence he was building. Weakest link. Watch what happens when the human is removed. Here's the thing that Instructor Threll did not understand about humans. And it is the same thing that most of the Concord still does not understand about us, because we have never had the chance to explain it in a setting like a formal briefing. Most species in the Concord grew up with some kind of built-in buffer between aggression and violence. The Alira can feel intention before it becomes action, and their culture developed around that early warning system. The Vosk have thick layered skin and a physical presence that makes most confrontations resolve themselves before they start, because nobody wants to test that skin without a very good reason. Species after species in the Concord evolved or developed some natural advantage that let them de-escalate physical conflict without ever needing to master it as a skill, because the danger of failing to de-escalate was rarely severe enough to force the lesson. Humans never had that advantage. We are not particularly strong. We do not have thick skin or claws or any natural weapon built into our bodies. What we have, going back thousands of years before any of us imagined leaving our own solar system, is technique. Centuries of learning, refined across cultures and generations, on exactly how to take someone's grip, someone's momentum, someone's committed motion, and redirect it into something that ends the moment cleanly, instead of escalating it further. It was never about matching force with force. It was about understanding balance, timing, and leverage well enough that force stopped mattering at all. I grew up in a family that took this history seriously. My mother taught coordination and restraint techniques at a training center outside a small coastal town, the same techniques her own mother had learned from an instructor who traced the lineage back generations further than that. I started training with her when I was 6 years old, not because anyone expected me to need it, but because she believed every person should understand their own body well enough that fear could never make the decision for them. By the time I left Earth for the Concord training program, I had spent more years practicing those techniques than I had spent doing almost anything else in my life. So when Instructor Threll's fingers closed around my wrist and his weight committed fully to that pull, I did not resist him. Resisting would have meant matching his strength, and he outweighed me by a margin that made resistance pointless. Instead, I stepped into the motion he had already started. I let his own pull carry my arm forward instead of back, rotated at the point where his grip was weakest, against the joint rather than against the muscle, and used the full weight of his committed momentum to fold him forward over my braced hip. He did not fall. Vosk do not fall easily, and I was never trying to put him on the ground. I only needed his motion to stop, and stopped as exactly what he was, arm extended at an angle that made pulling any harder a very poor decision on his part, balance borrowed entirely from mine, and very suddenly aware that the sentence he had been building for the observation gallery was no longer the sentence anyone in that room was going to remember. The silence that followed was different from the silence before. The first silence had been 60 cadets waiting to see a human get dragged out of a drill. This second silence was 60 cadets recalculating everything they thought they understood, all at the same time, in the same breath. I held the position for exactly as long as I needed to. Then I said, as calmly as I could manage, that the drill was not supposed to end until an officer called it, and that this particular lesson was over, because I had ended it myself. I released his arm. He straightened, recovering whatever dignity a 9-foot-tall instructor can recover after being stopped mid-stride by a cadet less than half his mass, and for a handful of seconds nobody in Base 7 seemed entirely sure whose authority the room actually belonged to. It belonged to Commander Alara Voss for the following 4 seconds, though I should mention immediately that she and I share no relation despite the shared surname, something the entire cohort found endlessly amusing for the rest of the term. Commander Voss called the drill from the observation deck in a voice that left no room for argument, and Instructor Threll walked out of Base 7 without another word to anyone, including me. I finished the exercise. Grace, Owen, and the 3 Karn cadets picked up exactly where we had left off. Because the drill itself had never required an instructor standing in the middle of it, it required 6 cadets who knew their roles and trusted each other, and we had that in full. We completed the second objective 4 seconds faster than our first attempt, which meant that whatever had just happened in the middle of the corridor had not shaken any of us nearly as much as Threll probably expected it to. The review that followed took 3 days, and I want to tell you honestly that those 3 days felt longer than the 5 weeks that came before them. Cadets from the observation gallery were interviewed. Sensor logs from the pod systems were pulled and examined frame by frame. Commander Voss reviewed the incident personally rather than delegating it, which several older cadets told me almost never happened for something involving a first-year training cohort. During those 3 days, something else happened that mattered just as much as the review itself. Cadets I had barely spoken to in 5 weeks started approaching me in the mess hall, in the corridors, during downtime between briefings. An Illyra cadet named Sella told me she had sensed something from Threll toward me for weeks that she now understood clearly for the first time, something she described as contempt wrapped in professional language, and she apologized for not saying anything sooner. A Karn cadet whose name translated closest to a low, steady tone told me, through the translation unit clipped to his collar, that our fire team's completion times had been strong the entire term, and that he had never once doubted my place in the formation. Even a few Voss cadets who I expected to close ranks around one of their own instructors quietly told me that Threll's file had concerned them before this incident, and that what happened in Base 7 had simply confirmed something they already suspected. The official finding came back on the 4th day. Instructor Threll had violated live drill protocol by entering an active simulation pod without authorization, had used unauthorized physical contact against a cadet during a training exercise, and had a documented pattern of evaluation bias that the review board described, in careful official language, as inconsistent with Concord training standards. He was reassigned to a non-cadet facing post within the week. Nobody made an announcement about it. Nobody needed to. Word travels through a training wing faster than any official memo, and the version that traveled was not that a human cadet had panicked under pressure. It was that a human cadet had stopped a 9-foot instructor mid-motion using nothing but footwork, timing, and a grip she had learned from her own mother before she was old enough to understand why it mattered. I sat down with Commander Voss privately after the review closed, mostly because she wanted to understand something that had genuinely puzzled her. She asked how I had managed to stay so composed in that moment, with 60 cadets watching and an instructor actively trying to remove me from a drill in front of the entire cohort. I told her the truth, which is that composure was never really the hard part. The hard part had been the 5 weeks before it, absorbing every small dismissal without letting it change how I trained or how I treated the people around me. The moment in Base 7 was almost easy by comparison, because it was physical, and physical problems have physical solutions, and I had spent my entire life learning exactly those solutions. She asked me to explain the technique itself, out of genuine curiosity rather than any disciplinary concern, and I told her what I am telling you now. Humans never developed a natural defense against aggression the way so many Concord species did. We do not have thick skin. We do not sense intention before it becomes motion. We do not have any built-in advantage that makes conflict resolve itself before it starts. What we built instead, across thousands of years and countless generations, was understanding. An understanding of balance, of leverage, of exactly how much of someone else's committed force you can borrow and redirect without ever needing to match it yourself. It is not about being stronger than the person in front of you. It has never been about that. It is about understanding motion clearly enough that strength stops being the deciding factor at all. Commander Voss listened to all of this without interrupting, and at the end she told me something I have thought about often since that day. She said the Concord had spent 11 years treating humanity as the newest and smallest member of a very old alliance, evaluating us against standards built for species who had never needed to develop what we had spent our entire history perfecting out of necessity. She said Instructor Threll's mistake was not unique to him. It was a mistake built into assumptions the wider Concord had never bothered to question, and it would take more than one incident in one training bay to correct all of it. But she said it was a start, and she thanked me for handling it the way I did, without escalation, without harm to anyone in that room, in a way that left the lesson clear without leaving anything behind that needed repairing. I finished that term at the top of my cohort's evaluation rankings, alongside Grace, who I am fairly certain will outrank me within another 2 years given how naturally leadership seems to come to her. Owen transferred into our cohort the following term, tired of being the only human in his own section, and he told me privately that the story of Bay 7 had already reached his old training wing before he even arrived, growing a little more dramatic with each retelling, though the actual truth needed no exaggeration at all. I think about that moment often, not because it was the most difficult thing I faced during training, but because of what it revealed to everyone watching, including me. Instructor Threll grabbed my wrist expecting to demonstrate a weakness he was already certain existed. What he demonstrated instead was exactly the opposite, and he did it in front of the one audience that mattered most, an entire cohort of cadets from 11 different worlds who would carry that lesson with them into every fire team they served on for the rest of their careers. Humans do not startle easily when someone reaches for us with bad intentions. We have been practicing exactly what to do about that for longer than most Concord species have existed as a unified people, and we did not learn it because it came naturally to us. We learned it because nothing about survival ever came naturally to us at all, and learning was the only advantage we ever had. That is the whole story of what happened in Bay 7, and it is the reason nobody in Cohort 9 ever again described the human cadet as the fragile one.